right, welcome back to Metflex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and today I have another solo Q&A episode for you. So these Q&A episodes are based off of questions that I get on my Instagram. So every Monday I post a question box. If you're following me on Instagram, my handle is at rachelgregory.cns. Any questions you have related to fitness, lifestyle, anything at all really, you can ask them in that question box on Mondays and I will answer them on the podcast. So today we have a bunch of questions to dive into, so I'm just going to get started. The first question was a short question. It said, veggies and bloating, ? So I'm assuming this person is just curious about the different vegetables that maybe cause the most bloating versus those that don't. Maybe you're suffering from some bloating and gas after consuming vegetables, which is pretty normal for a lot of people, especially if we're talking about those vegetables that do cause more bloating. So for this question, I guess I'll just dive into some of the most common veggies that cause bloating and then some of the ones that I found in general don't cause that much bloating. Again, it also comes back to the individual. So everybody processes vegetables and processes food differently, and it really comes down to kind of like the health of your GI tract. But in general, there are some vegetables that do cause more bloating than others. So the first is the cruciferous vegetable family. So these are things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale would be another one, and there's a bunch of other ones too, but those are the most common. And the main reason that these particular vegetables, the cruciferous vegetable family, tend to cause bloating is because humans actually don't produce the enzyme to break down raffinose, which is a complex sugar that's commonly found in cruciferous vegetables. And then also humans don't produce the enzyme cellulase, which is an enzyme that breaks down cellulose, which you've probably heard of. It's the main kind of substance that's found in the plant or vegetable cell wall, and that helps to, help the vegetable remain stiff and strong. We don't produce these enzymes, or we produce them in smaller amounts. When these vegetables get to the lower intestine, so our lower part of our intestine, they're actually fermented by bacteria, and this naturally causes the production of gas, which can in itself lead to bloating and cause you to produce gas as well. Well, cause the production of gas to come out of you, I guess you could say it. It's not that cruciferous vegetables are bad. No foods are bad or good. We kind of talk about that a lot on this podcast, I feel like. But for some people, especially those who are suffering from underlying gut issues, they can be a lot harder to break down. So that's just something that you need to be aware of, especially if you are suffering from gut issues and maybe things like irritable bowel syndrome. But realize that cooking any type of vegetable will probably make it easier to digest. So if you cook these vegetables down, steaming them, sauteing them, whatever it may be, to a good degree, that can help a lot with digestion. I mean, personally, I found the more I cook down cauliflower and cabbage, the easier it is for me to personally digest. Onions and garlic are another one. So these are another culprit of bloating. Like most other vegetables, like I mentioned, they cause bloating, especially in their raw form. So onions and garlic are considered one of the main sources of fructans, which is a type of soluble fiber that can often lead to bloating and gas. So again, cooking the onions and garlic and all of these other vegetables can reduce some of the digestive effects that occur as your body digests them. So just always keep that in mind. And then lastly, you've probably heard of FODMAPS. So FODMAPS stands for Fermentable Oligo, Mono-saccharides and Polyols. I know it's a mouthful of words, but basically these are just short chain carbs that are resistant to digestion. So instead of being absorbed into your bloodstream, they reach the far end of your intestine where most of your gut bacteria is. And your gut bacteria then actually uses these carbs for fuel, which will in turn produce hydrogen gas. And this can cause digestive symptoms and issues in individuals who are sensitive and have underlying gut issues or are just sensitive to these things. And not everyone is sensitive to FODMAPs. This is pretty much really common in those who suffer from irritable bowel syndrome, I would say, is the most common culprit of those who are sensitive to FODMAPs. And so vegetables that are high in FODMAPs include all the ones we just talked about. So Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, garlic, onions, most of those cruciferous vegetables. Other common ones are artichoke, asparagus, beetroot, fennel, leeks, mushrooms, okra, peas, and shallots. So those would be the most common FODMAP vegetables. There's also other foods that are high in FODMAPs too. I'm not going to go into all of those now, but you can do a quick Google search and find out foods that are higher in FODMAPs. If you are suffering from a lot of digestive issues or bloating or a lot of gas after you eat particular foods, then eliminating some of these FODMAPs could be a way to see which ones you're sensitive to or not. That's something just to keep in mind. And again, if you feel like you're someone who's suffering from more bloating, more digestive issues, and it's maybe not getting better, you could Google these FODMAP foods and see if they're some of the ones that you've been consuming a lot, and then maybe start just cutting some out and seeing how you feel. There are a few other tips that I'm going to dive into in a second that you could try. But I do want to dive into a few of the vegetables that generally cause the least bloating. These vegetables are lower in carbs and they're not likely to contribute to intestinal fermentation, which is why they are, more easily digestible by humans especially. These would be bell peppers, bok choy, cucumber, specifically with the skin removed, cooked spinach. So obviously raw spinach is something I mentioned can cause bloating and issues, but if you cook that spinach down, and with all of these, again, if you cook these vegetables down, they're a lot easier to digest. And then also zucchini and squash are really, I found personally, and with a lot of the clients I work with, those are also very easy to digest. Asparagus as well. So although asparagus, I mentioned, is a FODMAP, it again depends on the person. I've personally never had any issues digesting asparagus. I know a lot of people don't have issues digesting asparagus either. It doesn't cause any bloat. So again, it just comes back to the individual. So a few tips to help prevent bloating and gas from consuming vegetables. The first one would be just keeping your portions in check. So realizing, how much you're eating. I know for me, I'm a huge fan of vegetables. I love the volume, but if I go overboard and consume like a ton of broccoli in one sitting, it's not a good situation. Just keep your portions in check. That would be the number one thing. The second thing, I mentioned this already, but cooking any vegetables actually softens the fiber within that vegetable and shrinks the portion size as some of the water cooks out of it. So it'll basically take up less space in your GI tract. It won't eliminate or prevent bloating altogether, but it can make your veggies easier to digest. So cooking them down just it breaks them up a little bit more and makes them easier to digest for most people. The next tip would be to chew your food. So this is something a lot of people don't realize. And obviously when you're eating, you're kind of not thinking about it, but the more you chew your food, the more you're breaking it down, obviously, and the easier it will be to digest. And the main reason is because digestive enzymes are primarily produced in the stomach, pancreas, and your mouth. So your mouth is where digestion starts. So if you swallow your food just after chewing it for a few bites, it doesn't give these digestive enzymes a chance to really do their job. And as a result, digesting can be impaired from the start, making it harder for your body to actually break down and absorb the nutrients within that food. So just always remember to pay attention, become mindful when you're eating, chew your food as much as possible. It's very important, especially if you are someone suffering from any digestive issues, gas, bloating, anything like that. Kind of take a step back and think about when you sit down to your meal, are you chewing your food enough, right? So that might be something that is a very simple fix that can help and go a long way. The next tip would be choosing a high quality digestive aid that includes the specific digestive enzymes your body needs to break down that specific food. So a few tips if you do decide to take a digestive enzyme supplement. The first one would be always take it with food. So either right when you start to eat or maybe like 20 to 30 minutes before your meal. Probably don't want to take it any more than 30 minutes before that meal because remember, the digestive enzyme is there to help you break down that food as you're eating it. So it's not like a supplement that you just want to wake up and take it in the morning and not eat for hours. So definitely take it around your meal. The next tip would be making sure you're choosing a high quality digestive enzyme, also one that's specific to the type of food that you're struggling to break down. So if that's carbohydrates, there's different digestive enzymes that break down carbohydrates specifically. So for example, amylase and cellulase for more complex carbohydrates and fiber and things like that, versus lactase is an enzyme that helps break down lactose, which is the sugar in milk. And then also if we think about the other macronutrients, so protein and fat, there's different enzymes that break down protein specifically. There's different enzymes that break down fat specifically. So if you are struggling with vegetables is what we're talking about, then you want to make sure you pick a digestive enzyme that includes those specific enzymes that break down carbohydrates, specifically more complex carbs, fiber, things like that. The next tip would be just make sure you're staying hydrated while you're taking these digestive enzymes. That's just in general, you always want to stay hydrated, but the water will help with breaking down that fiber as well. Definitely stay hydrated. That's just a given. And then the last one would be, you don't want to necessarily be taking digestive enzymes forever. Kind of the goal is to help your body start to ramp up the production of those enzymes that you may not be producing. Some people take digestive enzymes, or they have to take them on a longer term basis, some people on a shorter term basis. It really just depends on you and what your body is doing. So I would say start slowly and just notice how your body responds to it. Maybe try to, if you're taking them for a few weeks, try to titrate them out and just pay attention to how your body responds. If you're having less bloating while you're taking them, and then, if you start to trickle them out and you notice bloating is coming back, maybe you do have to continue taking them. So it all comes back to the individual, and it all comes back to how your body's responding, and it's really just an experiment to see. There's really no one way to say, you need this digestive enzyme or you need this one. So it's all an experiment, but there are high quality brands out there. I would probably suggest going to consumerlab.com. That's where I usually check out the quality of the supplements I'm consuming. They break them down, they compare them, and that's a good place to really check out and make sure you're getting a high quality digestive enzyme supplement if you do choose to get one. So hopefully that made sense. Kind of a long-winded way of going through the different vegetables that cause bloating and those that generally don't cause bloating. But again, it all comes back to individual. It all comes back to you and your history with these things and what your gut is functioning like and things like that. So hopefully those tips help out a little bit. All right, so the next question, if you're not insulin resistant, how can you know if you're fat adapted or metabolically flexible? This is a great question. I actually dive into this exact question with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. So I'm going to link that podcast episode below. He talks all about, the different ways to see how metabolically flexible you are. In my opinion, there are a few different ways that you can find out how metabolically flexible you are. And I like to categorize this into two different categories. So the first category would be the subjective metrics. So those are just kind of your personal feelings and experiences and perspective, versus the objective metrics would be more like concrete, facts and observations based more on numbers and data and things like that. So if we're talking objective metrics, and these are things that, I'm going to talk about mostly the ones that you can, do at home, versus we talk with Dr. Mike about some of the ones that you need a lab for. So like VO2 max testing, things like that. So in terms of objective metrics, the main one that I would say is measuring your blood glucose response to meals. I would say you're metabolically flexible if you don't have huge drops or spikes in your blood glucose post meals. So you want your blood glucose level to stay relatively stable and also kind of come back to baseline within, I would say, an hour or two of consuming that meal. So you don't want to be on that blood sugar roller coaster. I think that's one of the biggest ways to kind of tell if you are metabolically flexible is how your body reacts to the different foods you're consuming, especially carbohydrates. So if you consume carbohydrates and you have a huge spike in blood glucose, and it takes, hours for it to come back to baseline, or you notice a huge drop, that would be an indication that you're probably not very metabolically flexible. Whereas if you can tolerate those carbohydrates and don't have a huge spike or a huge drop, and you kind of are remaining steady, or you kind of, you consume that meal and then you come back to baseline within an hour or two, that would probably be an indication that you are more metabolically flexible. So that's the main metric in terms of objective metrics that I like to use for clients and for myself. Another one is you could measure ketone levels. So in your blood, breath, and urine, blood is probably the most, or kind of the gold standard. There are breath ketone meters that are coming out now that are very accurate as well. Biosense is one that I've been using. I don't particularly track ketones anymore. I don't think that it's necessary unless if you're a data nerd, or you're just trying, I'm a data nerd, but I like to look at other data facts besides ketones. But if your goal is to get into ketosis, to check, how metabolically flexible you are, it's kind of the same thing as checking your blood glucose. You could see, if you consume carbohydrates, how long does it take to get back into ketosis after a higher carb meal? I guess the shorter amount of time it takes you to get back into ketosis after consuming a higher carb meal would potentially tell you that you are more metabolically flexible. So I played around with this when I was doing some fasting and some high carb meals. It is a good way to see, how your body responds to carbohydrates and things like that. So that would be another objective metric, is testing your ketones and seeing how long it takes to get back into ketosis after a higher carb meal. There's some other objective metrics, such as I talked about this with, and this is the first time I actually heard about this one, with Ben Pakulski in the episode that I did with him, which I'll link in the show notes. He discussed CO2 levels. So checking in your CO2 level can directly correlate to how metabolically flexible you are. So we chat all about that, or Ben chats all about that in that episode. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out that episode with Ben. I'll link it in the show notes. And then the last objective measurement would be training performance. So what are your training stats? This would be more like your numbers and things like that. Like, are you improving performance? Is your performance suffering? Depending on the different kind of foods you're consuming. Metabolic flexibility also does not just have to do with nutrition. It also has to do with training and performance and things like that. So some subjective metrics that would kind of tell you how metabolically flexible you are. The first one would be ease of fasting. So how easy is it for you to fast? The easier it is, probably the more metabolically flexible you are, because your body can, tap into your fat stores and your body fat to use for fuel, and can also tap into those fat stores to produce ketones. So that would be an indication that you are more metabolically flexible if you can go periods of time with fasting and not have lots of hunger pangs and not have, headaches and things like that. That's probably the main one that I like to use as a kind of indication of how metabolically flexible someone is that ease of fasting. The next thing would be your energy levels. So how you're feeling on a daily basis in terms of energy wise. Again, this also comes back to that fasting too. So if you are noticing that you're fasting and you just have no energy, that could be an indication that you are less metabolically flexible. If you have good energy throughout the day, that could be an indication that you are more metabolically flexible. And then also training performance with this too. So not just like the training stats and the numbers, but more like how you're feeling during your training. So again, your energy levels, just overall how, is your training performance good? Do you feel like crap? That could be a subjective metric. And then lastly, I would say this is just my kind of way of seeing or interpreting if some clients are more metabolically flexible than others, is kind of the emotional response to food. So this would be talking about carb phobia and fat phobia, which I talk a lot about in previous episodes. But what is your emotional response to food? Can you consume a sweet potato, or can you consume any type of carbohydrate and not be carb phobic around that food, or not feel guilty about it? Can you consume, higher fat foods and not feel quote unquote guilty about it? So this comes back to the psychological part of it. So I think the more metabolically flexible you are, the less psychological or emotional response you have to food. That's just what I've seen throughout just personally and with clients. So that would be another subjective metric. So hopefully that makes sense. Those are kind of the main ones that I personally go off, trying to dig deep and see how metabolically flexible I personally am, and then also clients that I work with. Hopefully those metrics make sense. Again, check out that episode with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. We dive into the subject a lot deeper. All right, the next question. Any diet suggestions for someone who is keto and struggles with low energy during HIIT? So HIIT would be high intensity interval training. This is a great question. So the main thing that I would first look at is, what is your electrolyte intake and hydration like? Are those in check? This is a big thing that a lot of people just tend to forget about. So hydration and electrolytes are super, super important for everyday life, but especially if you are performing any type of exercise at all. Making sure your electrolytes and hydration are in check is the first thing. The second thing is, if you have been, following a keto low carb diet for a while, or you're struggling with low energy during those high intensity training sessions, then I would look to implement more of a targeted ketogenic approach. That just means maybe playing around with incorporating carbs around your workouts, or a cyclical approach where I actually dive into all of the different types of carb ups and carb cycling in the episode that I released a few weeks ago. So I will link that episode in the show notes. It's called Carb Ups, Carb Cycling and Building an Anti-Fragile Metabolism. That episode goes all into how to incorporate carbohydrates, and we talk about how to do that around performance and as well. So if you are someone who is struggling with low energy levels, especially with HIIT workouts, and you have been keto for a while, carbs can have their place, especially for performance. So definitely check that episode out, and that will dive deeper into how to incorporate carbs around your workout to help with those energy levels. All right, the next question. What are your thoughts on the lion diet? Is it too strict? So the lion diet is a type of carnivore diet. It was actually named by Mikhaila Peterson, I believe. And the lion diet consists of only eating ruminant meat, salt, and water. So it's very much more restrictive than just a quote unquote normal carnivore diet. Carnivore diets have different stages or different restrictions depending on, what type of carnivore diet you're following. But in general, a regular carnivore diet would be just and only consuming anything that comes from animals. So it could be any animal, fish, poultry, cow, anything like that. And also like eggs and things like that, cheese, dairy, those would be considered part of a general carnivore diet, whereas the lion diet is only ruminant meat, salt, and water. And if you don't know what ruminant meat means, it's basically meat that comes from animals or ruminant animals, and those animals have 4 chambered stomachs, which allows them to break down the nutrients in plants to a greater degree than, say, humans or other animals who don't have those 4 different stomachs. So ruminant animals would be considered cows, sheep, goats, buffalo, deer, elk, giraffe, and camels. I definitely had to look up a few of those. I guess the more common ones would be cow, sheep, goat, and I guess buffalo and elk. Those are probably the most common ruminant meats that are consumed. So my opinion on the lion diet would be, I think it is useful for those people who may be suffering from certain issues that they can't figure out. I guess it is the ultimate elimination diet. I think especially with a lot of the anecdotal evidence that's out there, there's actually been thousands of people who have followed a carnivore or even more strict the lion diet, reporting complete remission of different autoimmune issues, psychological issues, other digestive illnesses, and then improvements in things like cognitive, emotional, and other physical health markers, specifically depression and things like that. So I think that the lion diet is, if you are someone who has been suffering from something that you can't figure out, incorporating this type of protocol for a few weeks, a few months to really dive in to see, what foods could be affecting you personally, and not just talking about digestive issues either. We're talking about like I mentioned, autoimmune, depression, psychological issues, things like that. The reason is because our body reacts to different compounds in plants, and sometimes even in non-ruminant animal meat. So there are people who can be more sensitive to that than others. I think the line diet is, like I said, it's basically your ultimate elimination diet. But I do think that for your average person who isn't suffering from any of these type of ailments, it's probably not necessary. But again, it's the ultimate elimination diet. So if you are having issues, maybe try it for a few weeks or a few months, and then slowly introduce different foods and see how you personally react to those foods. So that's what I would suggest, or how I would suggest incorporating this type of diet. It is very strict. Again, it's only ruminant meat, salt, and water. Personally, I've tried a carnivore diet for about a month, and I love my veggies. I love my avocado specifically. So it was rough for me, but I do think, again, if you are suffering from something and you can't figure it out, this would probably be a good place to start. All right, next question. Best protein supplement that's keto. So I think this person is referring to probably protein powder or protein powders. So most protein powders out there, especially if we're talking ones that are, whey protein, collagen, things like that, most of those that I've seen are quote unquote keto just because they are lower in carbs. Not most protein powders that I've seen have high amounts of carbs unless they're adding sugar, or if they're more vegan-based protein powders. But if you're going with more of the isolates and the collagen, usually they have lower carbs in general. So I would just say, if you're looking for a protein powder, just look at the nutrition facts label. Probably go with anything that has less than 2 grams of carbs, 2 or 3 grams of carbs. The ones that I personally use, I'll link these in the show notes, but I personally use Perfect Keto Whey, Perfect Keto Collagen. I like Organifi, I like Primal Kitchen, and then I also like the Quip Prime beef protein. So those are the main protein powders that I use, especially when I'm making protein ice cream. Again, I will link all of those below. The reason I like those is because I know that those companies are super high quality, but you do want to do your own research. There are tons of different protein powders out there. There can be a lot that are low quality, and the supplement industry itself can be very, very sketchy. So you want to make sure you do your research. A good place to check out the quality of the different protein powders out there, or just other supplements in general, is consumerlab.com. So if you're curious about any supplements, I would check out consumerlab.com. I'll link it in the show notes. You can go there and basically just type in the company and the supplement you're interested in, and they will give you a review of that supplement itself, and they actually grade it on a grading scale. So check that out. Always do your own research when it comes to these things. And then also with protein powders especially, you want to make sure that they're third-party tested. That's one thing to look at as well. And again, you'll be able to find that on consumerlab.com. So I will link both the protein powders that I recommend and I use in the show notes, and then also I'll link the link to consumerlab.com. All right, last question for today, best book recommendations. So instead of listing out all of my favorite books, I actually have on my Amazon shop page, I have a category that has all of my book recommendations in it. So as I read books, and whether or not I like them or not, I will add them to this category. So I'm going to link my book recommendation list in the show notes, so you can check that out. Again, it's on my Amazon shop page. You can also go to, I believe it's amazon.com/shop/KillingItKeto. I'll link that in the show notes so you can check it out, and that will have all of my favorite books, ones that are nutrition based, self-development, personal development, some business ones, things like that. All right, those are all the questions I have for today. Again, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share it with your friends, your family. You can post it on Instagram or Facebook and tag me, and that's the best way to help spread the word about the podcast. And also, if you haven't left a review yet, I would love to hear what you think about the show. Any improvements I can make, anything that you want me to dive into, just let me know. You can leave a review on iTunes or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, and I'll be able to check that out. All right, I'll see you next time.